Hello, I'm Lisa Pavelka, and I'd like to share with you some of my favorite tips and tricks for working with my Quick Cure UV Resin Magic Gloss. It's unlike other resins, and it requires no measuring, no mixing, and it's non-toxic when handled properly, and it cleans up with a baby wipe or soap and water. It creates beautiful finishes like glass on all kinds of surfaces like polymer, metal, and epoxy clays, and much more. So let's get started. Whenever I'm curing something with Magic Gloss as a finish, I use a small craft mirror or tile or like this small piece of glass insert from a tiny picture frame, and I use some scrap polymer clay, or you can buy a block of inexpensive clay and use that over and over. Now this does a couple things. When we take our piece with the Magic Gloss and we want to cure it either under a UV light like my UV light you can get on my website or out in the sun, you don't want this to happen as you're curing it. You don't want it to slide off your cure surface. The other thing is some things may not lay flat, like the bail of this piece prevents it from laying completely flat. So I'm going to put it and press it down. It'll adhere to the uncured clay. And make sure you're over a big enough surface that if you overflow, it's going to flow underneath. And you can continue curing and then clean up the excess from the edges and the bottom later. It's better not to overflow, of course, but this is a great way to keep it from getting stuck to your work surface and making an irreparable mess. Now, Magic Gloss, and I'll say this over and over and over again, always gets cured by adding it first to the center. Now, this is a piece that, in theory, would only take one thick layer, but I'm going to tell you how you prevent air bubbles and then how to fix them if they occur. But the first thing you want to do is add a thinner layer, even on a thin piece. And now I can check and see that it's running all towards this side, which tells me my piece isn't level. So I can, with my hands, or I can go in there with my tool and re-level the whole piece. So even though this isn't going to fill it to my satisfaction, I'm just going to put up enough of a layer that it can reach around the edges. And I would probably let it sit for several minutes. In some cases, like this next piece, up to 5 or 10 minutes. The reason for that is you may have little cracks or crevices or areas where the Magic Gloss can seep into. Now it's not prone to having bubbles, but let's see if we have any bubbles on this. If they're on or near the surface, I can run a windproof or a butane torch. I can run a flame over it for 1 quick second, and let's see how quick that second really is. And if there's any bubbles, they'll pop so quickly it might be hard to even tell. I just saw one pop there. Now by letting it sit, any air that gets in there, either from spreading it, that can fold air into it, or squeezing your bottle too quickly onto your piece, or the cracks and crevices where the Magic Gloss might still be working its way into and seeping into gradually. Those are areas where air pockets can form, and in order to pop a bubble, it has to be on or near the surface. If it's beneath the surface and you rush it to the light or your cure lamp, it can start rising to the top before it's fully cured and create an unsightly bubble. Okay, one more time, I'm going to check it. And there we go. I don't recommend using a hairdryer or a heat gun because it's forced air that can push the Magic Gloss up and over the edge. So this piece would get cured. Okay, now we're ready to add our final layer because we've got a bit of a bezel wall here. And I have yet to decide, I'll decide how I like the look of this as I do it, if I'm going to bring it right up to the edges and keeping it inside of the striped framing, or if I'm going to carry it right up to the very, very outer edges. So stopping there, knowing I can come back and add more, let's spread it around and check it first to make sure, first, that it's level, and second, that I need more before I get too crazy and add too much. Even after I cure this, I can always come back and add another layer Right now I'm just pushing it so it stays contained within that clay striping, and that is the bezel wall I've created for this piece. You don't have to have a bezel wall to hold it in place. We talk about that on my tip for working on open-sided pieces with Magic Gloss, and I think I want to give it a bit more of a dome. I can't hold it up on its side just yet so you can see how nice and rounded the effect is. Now that's about as far as I can go without overflowing it or having to bring it up against the edges. And I see some bubbles just resting right on the top. I added my Magic Gloss very quickly, so that formed some bubbles. So I have the crust underneath. There's not really many places for air bubbles to form. These bubbles, which you might not be able to see them, but they're right there. Those formed by squeezing it out of my bottle, and my bottle of Magic Gloss is just on its last little bit, so air can tend to come out then. So I'm igniting a butane torch, and take a look. This is going to happen quickly. There they go. Into the light it goes, and in 5 to 10 minutes it's ready to wear. I think that came out beautifully. If you'd like to see how to add a pointed back crystal to the surface of cured Magic Gloss, stay tuned for that tip later in this video. And this is an example of a piece that definitely should have much more time allowing it to cure. The reason for that is, as you can see, there's a lot of dimensional details in here and elements. And again, these are places where the Magic Gloss can sit and seep into corners and cracks and edges, and you want to give time for the bubbles to rise up through the surface. This one's ready for its final layer, just to cover up any of the dimensional surface effects. You can maybe see here a hint of some items kind of sticking up out of the surface. Again, I could carry it just to the inside of my frame or all the way out to these edges if I choose. So let's just give this a final dome finish. Maybe you could hear that. That was the end of my bottle. That's when some bubbles can occur. And I don't need a real thick layer. I just need enough to self-level across my surface. So just gradually checking, making sure that it's level, and spreading it not all so much to one side to start with, just taking it nice and easy and working my way towards the edges. And if you don't have a surface that you can rotate this on, you're always run the risk of having corners and edges that you have to go back and fill later. Now I have micro tips that you can get that adapt to the Magic Gloss bottles, both the large 6-ounce bottle and the 1-ounce bottle. But I wouldn't try to fill in any gaps with those. You're just going to get an kind of a ridge in your work. And in order to get a nice smooth finish from the center to the edge, especially when you want that rounded cabochon effect, it's really critical that you add enough working in layers that you can get to the edge without it pulling back, and that can take several layers, 2 to 3 layers, as we've discussed. But you flood coat the surface, which means coating the surface with enough that it will self-level. And then we're going to just check this last one for bubbles. And I believe one more drop or two would really work. Now, if it overflows, which you learn very quickly how much a piece will take before that happens, but yet over 10 years later, since the introduction of Magic Gloss to the retail market, I still get bubbles, or overflowing, I should say, from time to time. But working on this raised pedestal is really important so it can flow underneath, which means that pedestal can't be any bigger or stick out from the edge of the piece that you're covering, And you can see here I got a nice couple of juicy bubbles. Wow, there were quite a few there. And into the light it goes. The glossy, smooth finish looks just like real glass, and it's incredibly durable and scratch resistant. Some items that aren't waterproof may react when Magic Gloss is applied, causing things like inks and paints to bleed, so they need to be sealed in order to make them waterproof. An example of that might be an inkjet print. So you want to use a sealer that will make it waterproof and not react to Magic Gloss. Sealers that are water-based like these are great products when they're used for their intended use, but they're not compatible with Magic Gloss. Be sure to check the label or the product website if you can't find an indication of what type of product you're working with. When I seal, I like to use liquid clay, which I can cure with the heat gun, but you can also use packing tape or laminating film to make your piece waterproof. Another option is to use an acrylic spray sealant. I often get asked how you add Magic Gloss to something that's open-sided or doesn't have a bezel wall to hold the resin in place. A lot of people don't check the directions or the website and don't see that it usually takes 2 to 3 thin layers to reach the outside edge. It wants to pull in, it wants to dome. Now here's a nice flat piece here that I made as a charm, and I've already drilled a hole in it. So here's an extra little tip of what you can do when you need to work with a piece like that. Maybe you're covering a button or something else with holes in it. You can just take a little bit of scrap of polymer clay. I'm just going to roll a little bit and plug it right in there, and very carefully shave off the excess with a clay blade, leaving that hole plugged. We're going to come back and drill that later, drill that back out after the Magic Gloss is cured for about 10-15 minutes in the light or the sun, and then give it another half hour outside of the light or the sun so it doesn't yellow, and then we can drill through there. I know it's going to pull in from the edges, so I find I get better results if I know I'm going to do a piece like this in 2 or 3 thin layers. You can try to add a lot more, but the chances are it's just going to overflow if you add too much at once. Now what causes it to pull back from the edges on flat pieces that are compatible for covering with Magic Gloss, like this baked polymer clay Millefiori cane slice, is it wants to dome. It wants to pull in on itself. So let's go ahead and bring it all the way to the edges. Another reason why we want to work on a cure surface is we can see that we're bringing it all the way out to the edges. And if I give it a few seconds, hopefully you can see it on camera, it's subtle, but it's there. You can start to see it pulling in from the edges already. It's pulling in and it's pulling up on itself, and it's going to continue to do that. So don't be surprised if you have a big area around there that you need to fill. So let's just check it for bubbles with a one quick flash from a butane torch or a windproof lighter. There were a few bubbles there, and they popped very quickly. And we're going to cure this for about 5 minutes, and then we're ready to come back out and add our next layer. Okay, so our open-sided piece has been under the light for about 4 or 5 minutes, which isn't long at all, and the surface may be still slightly tacky to the touch, but we're not going to worry about that. Can you see that the edges here are a little exposed? It didn't pull in too much, but it pulled in some. So just to review, to get Magic Gloss to stay along the edges of open-sided work, you have to apply 2 or more layers, and you have to let each layer cure between applications. Be sure to always add Magic Gloss from the center and spread to the edges as discussed earlier in the video. Surface tension and gravity will do the rest. Now, speaking of open-sided pieces, this piece right here, because it's got some surface texture or tooth, may only need 1 layer of Magic Gloss, and oftentimes something like this will keep the resin right up to the very edges with only 1 layer, but a second can be added for more height. Also in sharper point areas like this point, that's an area where even though if it stays contained and pulled against these edges, it may pull back from here. But one of the advantages of Magic Gloss pulling back on open-sided settings is that it will hold a bead, and you can often just highlight, and here I'm using my control tip, highlight areas that you want to embellish with Magic Gloss because it will stay where you put it and usually needs an extra layer over the top to let that raised cured area act as a location where surface tension can take hold. So I'm just highlighting the halo here and dragging it out where I want it. And it's not going to spread unless I add too much, any more or any less than I want it to. So I can just really showcase some of those areas right there. Bring it back down into here, get the whole halo. And when I go to cure it, it's going to stay right where I want it to be. And just 5 or 10 minutes is all it'll take, and she'll have a raised dimensional halo. Even though it's harder to have problems with bubbles in Magic Gloss when you compare it to other 2-part epoxy resins, they can still happen, like this one right there. But let's talk about how we can fix that one. So what you need is a power drilling tool, and I like a diamond tip bit. You could also use a carbide. This is a Dremel tip that's a diamond tip one, and you notice it's pointed, but it's a little domed, it's rounded. So that's the one I prefer, but you can use whatever you like. And you never want to drill into Magic Gloss until about an hour after it's cured. It only takes 5 to 10 minutes in sunlight or a UV lamp to cure, but if you leave it in too long, it can yellow. But it's rock hard on the surface in just minutes, but it can take up to an hour for the underlying layers to cure. And those continue to cure even once you've taken it out of the UV light or the sun. I call that shadow curing. So then you can drill into it and you'll see a fine dust. So if you're going to drill a lot, make sure you're in a well-ventilated area, and maybe even consider wearing a dust mask or wrapping a scarf around your face, because nobody should inhale any kind of dust if they can help it. But it's going to be noisy for just a second. I'm going to drill out that hole. There. Now you want to open it up really well, and you want to make sure that you get out any dirt or debris that might be in there. So you can just blow it away, or you can take a paintbrush or an old toothbrush and just clean that out. But you'll notice it's white. It's still white. And you want to make sure you get the whole, the entire hole, the whole hole, I almost said. That's going to go back to crystal clear, so we're going to put it right on our cure surface. Now some people will just try to fill that hole with a drop or two of Magic Gloss, especially using the Magic Gloss with my micro tip. But you're just going to either find that you're going to have too little, it's going to be concave and you'll have a dimple, or you're going to end up having too much and you end up with a pimple. So we don't want a dimple or a pimple. The trick is to put enough Magic Gloss in so that it not only fills that hole, that's where we're going to start. This bottle's about gone. Okay, so we're going to fill that hole. Let's make sure it gets in there nice and good because we don't want another air bubble to form. So I'm just going to work it down in there, and I want you to see, you might be able to tell where the hole was by the depression that's forming. See, it's just filling that hole nicely. But you can see it's completely crystal clear. There's no more of that white that we saw after drilling. So we're going to go ahead now that we filled the hole. See, I've got a dimple. Can you tell? Let's take a look. Yeah. But now we're going to add another layer to flood coat the whole surface, adding from the center, as I always recommend. So I had enough room here to add at least one more layer. I could probably do two. And I'm bringing it right up to the very edges of my setting. So the setting is no longer holding it in. It's just surface tension and gravity that's holding it in place. And then I can add more if I deem it necessary. I'm going to let that self-level for a second. And voila, we have a beautiful finished dome piece. Now remember when I talked about adding crystals to our Magic Gloss resin? You can easily do that by waiting a half an hour to an hour after you've cured your resin. Drill it the same way you would as if you were fixing a bubble. After cleaning out the debris, you can glue a pointed back crystal into place using a drop or two of Magic Gloss and then curing, or you can use jeweler's cement. Just be sure to drill the hole a little bit smaller than you think you need, because you can always go back to enlarge it. You can find Magic Gloss in both the 1 ounce and the 6 ounce size on my website, along with my UV Cure lamp. Just visit www.lisapavelka.com and be sure to follow me on all the social network sites like Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, Twitter, and YouTube. You'll find a wealth of information, including inspirational gallery photos, upcoming classes and creative cruises, free tutorials, and much more. Well, I hope this video has inspired your inner artist to go and play with some Magic Gloss.